We got the Prague Spring this time, one of the 3 Cold War crises. And you can see here from the specification where it appears. So if you've learnt anything about the Cold War to this point, you'll know that life in Eastern Europe was sometimes quite miserable. And this is one of the big reasons why the Prague Spring happened. There was no freedom of speech, censorship of the media and the television, the newspapers. There was a secret police which would arrest anybody who they suspected of opposing communism and the government. The economy of Czechoslovakia, its position in Europe, it should have been a stronger economy. But it was a weak economy, and the economy that was created was actually created for the benefit of the Soviet Union rather than for Czechoslovakia, because things were made in Czechoslovakia and sent to the Soviet Union. Also, before Stalin died, he'd purged people across the whole of the communist world, which meant he'd killed lots of them, the ones that were under his control anyway. And so people were upset still about the aftermath of all the people that had been killed under Stalin. And there were few consumer goods, things that we take for granted now, like jeans and shoes and record players. Well, they used record players then, not so much now. These things were in short supply in Czechoslovakia, and it was the students more than anything who were really upset about this. And they started the protests. Those were the causes behind it, but the Prague Spring actually kicked off in 1966 with students protesting, as it says here, because they didn't feel that they were getting the right standard of living, and they were annoyed about not being able to speak out about the things they saw was unfair. And as a result of these protests, Khrushchev actually allowed a new leader of Czechoslovakia to be put in position, which was this fellow Dubček. Make no mistake about Dubček, he really was a communist, but he wanted what he called socialism with a human face. Now, socialism is often what communists would call themselves. That's really all you need to know at this stage. So it means communism with a human face, and by that he means a bit nicer. So he wanted to allow some of the things that the students were upset about, like he wanted to allow them to be able to say as they felt. He wanted to have greater trade with the West, which would mean more consumer goods, people being able to actually travel to the West. To give trade unions greater power, which is to give the workers more power and freedom to have a say in how much they were paid. And they even started to discuss the possibility of multi-party free democratic elections, although nothing happened with that. It was just at the talking stage. Something similar had happened in Hungary in the 1950s. And what had happened is the Soviet Union had invaded. Because Hungary had said that they were, or the Hungarians at the time, Imre Nagy, had said that they were going to leave the Warsaw Pact, the military alliance of communist countries. Dubček knew this, so he was very careful to make absolutely clear that he had no intention of leaving the Warsaw Pact, because he didn't want to give any excuse for the Soviets to want to invade. But Brezhnev didn't really need an excuse, as we'll see. Is the man himself with the greatest eyebrows in history, eyebrows bigger than a moustache. Well, he, as you can see here, is very alarmed at the pace of change in Czechoslovakia, and especially seemed to be alarmed that Dubček had invited Tito and Ceausescu, the leaders of Yugoslavia, Tito, and Romania, Ceausescu. Both of those countries were communist, but they'd had at that point, they'd not been behaving according to the Soviet Union as they wanted, so they were being a bit rebellious. And so Brezhnev was really alarmed that they were being invited to Czechoslovakia, a country he was worried about. Of course, the other point is, as soon as people were allowed to some more freedom of speech, they took the opportunity to criticise communism and the Soviet Union. So all of this upset Brezhnev and may have contributed to his massive eyebrows. Probably not the eyebrows thing. Don't write that in your exam, please. So Brezhnev ordered Warsaw Pact troops from other Eastern European nations and the Soviet Union to invade Czechoslovakia. He'd actually been trying to sort of intimidate Dubček into doing as he liked by telling those troops to carry out manoeuvres like practice fights. on the outskirts of Czechoslovakia. Anyway, he ordered them to invade 500,000 troops. The Czechoslovakians didn't really try to fight back. A few brave individuals did, but mostly they were just stood in the streets crying, heartbroken. One incredibly brave man, Jan Palach, set himself on fire and died as a result of the injuries he caused to himself. And it was a protest. He was a very young man. He had his whole life ahead of him. He sacrificed his life and his future in a protest, and he became a symbol of sort of resistance against communism. But mostly, it was just they came in. The Warsaw Pact troops were really surprised when they came to Czechoslovakia, how annoyed the Czechoslovakians were that they came, because they'd been told that they were coming to sort of liberate and save the Czechoslovakians from a few protesters. When they got there, they realised that actually they weren't welcome. And in the wake of this, Brezhnev announced his doctrine. Doctrine is basically what a political leader says he believes, and says it's like what he thinks and says he's going to do. So the Brezhnev doctrine was, he said publicly that the actions of any one communist country affects all communist countries, so it's the duty of all the other communist countries to step in if one particular communist country is not behaving in the right way. In other words, he's saying, no one else try this, or you're going to get what the Czechoslovakians got. Dubček's arrested, replaced by some fella called Husak, who's going to be more harsh and reverse all of the measures, and thousands of ordinary Czechs were arrested too. And that was the end of that. So the final bit of the specification is to look at the international reaction. Well, the Americans and the West were like, whoa, we're really mad about this, but they didn't actually do anything, which was another example of them doing nothing. To add to all of the others, so showing the Soviets that in their puppet states they could do as they liked, because the West were not going to really take any significant action. Perhaps the most significant aspect of the international reaction is Yugoslavia and Romania, who were already not really getting on with the Soviet Union. Their relations were strained further because they said that is absolutely the wrong thing to do. Communist parties across the West had looked to Moscow for advice and resources. Well, the communist parties of Italy and France said, no, we don't agree with this, and stopped communicating with Moscow. On the other hand, other governments in the Warsaw Pact, in countries, of course, that didn't really want communism, those governments were happy because they could be confident that their citizens would be less likely to protest and rebel, because Brezhnev was saying, if they did, this is what's going to happen to you. And there you go, the Prague Spring, the Czechoslovakian crisis.